I'm Neetha Bidway, and this is Good Revenue. Today, we're going to do a quick dive into some new findings about ultra-processed foods and some of the health and market implications of this research. We'll also do a deep dive about AI and cybersecurity. And in the middle of that, we'll get into geopolitics, the EPA making more moves when it comes to chemicals, board governance, and a couple other topics. If you're new, this is a fact-based show. You'll always find links to all of the resources and data that we cite in our show notes. Hit the subscribe button if you haven't already, and let's dive right in. Ultra-processed foods really are a health crisis. A new study from the Lancet has done a meta-analysis of 104 studies. 92 of them link eating copious amounts of ultra-processed foods, which they shorten to UPFs, to diseases like obesity, diabetes, heart disease, Crohn's, kidney problems, liver problems, and early death. So super serious consequences. This report finds that ultra-processed foods damage every organ in the body and that they're effectively made to be addictive, which is why as we become addicted to them, we no longer desire fresh foods, and that causes a host of other issues as well. This study also has a series of policy recommendations based on successful initiatives in countries like Brazil and Mexico, including taxes, warning labels, advertising restrictions, and a wide range of other solutions. This is no doubt something that the processed food industry will want to challenge. But if this is something that is at all of a concern to you in your life, or if this is something you're worried about when it comes to kids, I think scanning this Lancet research is probably a good idea. And I also wanted to flag, a few weeks ago, we talked about California's ban on school lunch, including ultra-processed food. And that is something that the industry is trying to challenge. So we'll link to that too if you want more information about how this is currently being addressed in the United States. Speaking of food, we have a new company in the class of trillion-dollar companies. I always have to check my numbers when I think about it because it breaks my brain to know how many trillion-dollar companies we have. As I record this, it's about 12. Eli Lilly is the latest entrant to the trillion-dollar club, and that is largely due to the fact that its drugs, Zepbound and Mounjaro, are doing really, really well. And those drugs help with obesity and weight loss, in addition to diabetes in the case of Mounjaro. And I think this is worth flagging because, as we discussed in the prior story, there certainly does seem to be a link between these two things. So even as processed foods and ultra-processed foods have become a global health crisis, we're also seeing the fast follow of obesity, according to many research studies and a lot of data, some of which we will link here. All of this is really interesting because this trillion-dollar club is very tech heavy. So Eli Lilly is joining the ranks of Microsoft, obviously NVIDIA, dominating up at $5 trillion, in addition to Meta, Alphabet, Apple, and a host of others. Berkshire Hathaway is also on that list too. The EPA is on a roll when it comes to toxic PFAS forever chemicals. They have just okayed the 5th PFAS chemical to be used on crops like corn and soy. And so these are added to the concerns of critics. So we now have questions about whether or not it makes sense to have these toxic forever chemicals in our food supply. And the Environmental Protection Agency has decided that this does make sense, which I think is concerning. The approval context here, this is a specific chemical that the EPA is allowing producers to use, and it is distinct from their decisions when it comes to PFAS chemicals being used in the water supply, in air pollution, soil, etc. So it's a little bit complicated to track all of this, but it does seem to be part of a wider strategy to introduce more of these forever chemicals into both our food supply and the wider environment. U.S. taxpayers have been paying for a lot of data and analysis on the part of the U.S. federal government for decades, and that has been very helpful to agencies, including the Federal Reserve, in steering our economy. And it's also really helpful to the private sector as well as to universities and a host of other recipients of this information. It's really, really important. So unfortunately, we have just learned that the Bureau of Labor Statistics, that's the BLS, is not going to have any jobs data for October. And it's also not going to have some of its employment reporting for September. We did a story a couple weeks ago on the private sector side. Challenger, Christmas, and Gray found that the largest drop in jobs occurred in October to the tune of 153,000 jobs. That's the most since October of 2003. So it was a really big deal, and it's really concerning that we won't have the government verification of that. So something to keep in mind if this is something you're tracking. And the bigger issue and takeaway here too is that this means that the Fed is effectively having to fly blind in making decisions about rate cuts and how to navigate the economy. So there's an upcoming meeting for the Fed in December, and the reports indicate that Fed leaders are mixed in whether or not they think we need more interest rate cuts, and it's due to the fact that we don't have good data. One other report that was cut right before the federal government shutdown, which was the longest ever in U.S. history, is the hunger report. And that was authored by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And that is, I think, another example of a really significant piece of information that we no longer have access to at a time when we need good, clean data more than ever. Speaking of folks who love good data, especially when it's coming from the US government, let's pivot and we'll talk a little bit about corporate boards. A new study from PwC, this is their annual survey of corporate directors, finds that a historic high, that's 55% of sitting corporate directors believe at least one member of their corporate board should be replaced. This is a trend line that has been increasing in the last few years, and this is now a high watermark of note. Some more details on this. 41% of directors say that peers don't contribute to the board, and that's one of the reasons they should be replaced. 34% also blame the fact that many board members sit on boards for too long, and that is a drag on meaningful engagement in the work of corporate governance. One of the other challenges noted by this PwC report is that there is a significant skills gap identified by corporate directors. Only 32% of directors note that boards today have the right skills to meet the moment. And that is really concerning when you think that the role of a corporate board is governance and steering an organization. Looking ahead, the priorities on corporate boards this year include AI and cybersecurity, along with dealing with the constant volatility and economic conditions that change minute to minute, as well as geopolitics. And some of those findings also come to us from the National Association of Corporate Directors. They do a really great quarterly report. And if you are tracking corporate boards, I recommend checking that out too. Switching gears, let's get into geopolitics with a few quick updates. The G20 just met in South Africa. Unfortunately, the United States decided to boycott this meeting, which gave other nations a chance to lead. India has some news. They have been trying to open up their foreign direct investment. And when it comes to financial services, they are going to allow foreign investors to own up to 49% of some Indian banks. BlackRock is one of the folks looking to buy into that. On the rare earths front, one piece of news, the Europeans have recently opened up a facility in Estonia that's going to hopefully produce a lot of rare earths magnets. These are very important to the automotive sector as well as others. And we've done a whole bunch of stories on rare earths this year. It's a hot topic and we'll continue to track it because it's important to so many different sectors. The US-China relationship continues to be just very novel in every respect. As we record this, the leader of China called the president of the United States, which doesn't happen all that often. And they are said to have discussed Taiwan, Ukraine, and trade. No doubt there's other issues on that list too. And we've done a lot of episodes on China, which we'll link to here as well if you want broader context on what that conversation may have involved, but we're curious to see what shakes out. Now, one thing that came up in the recent meeting of these two leaders at the end of October, China had committed to buying 12 million tons of U.S. soybeans. This is a big deal to the United States because soybeans are our most valuable crop by export value. So far, the Chinese have bought about 1.6 million tons. And as we record this, we're at the very end of November. So time is very short to get up to that 12 million ton goal. And it doesn't look like the Chinese are there yet. So stay tuned on that one. Switching gears, let's get into AI and cybersecurity threats. 2025 has been a really difficult year when it comes to the rise in AI-linked or AI-driven cybersecurity attacks. Microsoft's latest threat report indicates that Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea have all significantly ramped up their attacks against the US government, US companies, and US universities. And the report has a lot of data and findings if you want to get into specifics. One area flagged by Microsoft involves AI-generated news, fake news, the real kind. And they have 200 examples of AI-linked news being disseminated. That is up significantly over 2024. And back in 2023, just 2 years ago, there were only 10 of these examples. Microsoft also notes that the methods being used include phishing, weak software, exposed internet services, and information stealing tools are all being used across the board. Anthropic also had a new AI report that you should take a look at if you're tracking cybersecurity threats. They revealed the first big AI-led cyber spying was effectuated by China using Claude's AI tool. And 80 to 90% of this attack was autonomous by AI agent. Now, this means that scanning, breaking in, moving inside, and stealing the data were all accomplished autonomously. AI basically was able to do all of this on its own without that much human help, which is very concerning for a lot of different reasons. And as Anthropic notes, that means that the same tools that in theory we're using to make our companies more successful are also being used against them to steal or to do other things that are really a challenge. Amazon also released a set of findings that indicates that nation states are using a mix of AI and cybersecurity to effectuate kinetic warfare. And they have a specific example tied to Iran. In addition, they note that VPNs, hacked servers, live data, and company hacks are all being used to find targets, and that the lines are really being blurred between cyber warfare and real warfare. The risks here are that companies who are not tied to the military, so non-defense tech or just non-military firms, are now basically part of the landscape when it comes to how war can be effectuated. On the positive side, Amazon also had an example recently of how they're using autonomous AI to actually track and respond to cyber attacks. So a little bit of good news in there. But in general, all of these stories are really concerning when it comes to the use of AI to aggravate the problem of cybersecurity threats. And I think this builds on the report that we shared last week in which Google filed a suit. It's the first ever against a group of hackers based in China over a massive phishing ring. And so it's very clear that all of the major tech companies are trying to do what they can on this topic. But we're talking about basically global warfare that private companies are now also getting drawn into. And our last story, when we can, we like to close with positive news. And we had a great story about how AI is actually being used to help citizens in the US too. There are two examples in Honolulu and San Jose of city governments using AI to do the work of city governments. And that is things like fixing potholes. In the case of San Jose, they have had serious success since 2023. Their pilot program to find potholes has 97% accuracy, And they've also been able to cut illegal trash dumping by 88% through the use of AI. So that's actually pretty good news. And we hope that we have more examples of where AI is benefiting people or really generating business positive ROI and P&L ROI. We really do look for those as much as we can. And with that, that's all we have for you today. We'll see you back here soon. Thanks for listening. If you liked what you heard, leave us a review, subscribe to the show, or check out another episode. We appreciate your support.